G'day, it's Gilbert Holmes, campaigning to represent Queensland in the Federal Senate, and today I'm talking about refugee policy. Specifically, I'm asking refugee advocates, people who care about outcomes for refugees and asylum seekers, and if you were thinking of voting Greens, I'm asking you to not vote Green. And what I have here is a sandwich board that I've made up for my campaign, specifically targeting the Greens in this context with their refugee policy. I was a member of the Greens until around this time here, 2011, 2010, 2000, around then. Around the same time as Julia Gillard and Labor realised that they had got refugee policy very wrong with the reintroduction of onshore processing. What was happening at that time was, I'll run you through this little graph here. This shows known asylum seeker deaths at sea between 2000 and 2000 and current year, 2025. So here we had John Howard here has introduced offshore processing in 2001, and these deaths, this was called the Suspect Illegal Entry Vessel 10, the CIVX, was a huge number of deaths, accounting for most of these deaths here. That was actually just after Howard introduced offshore processing. But subsequent to that, then for the next 7 years, there was 0 recorded deaths at sea associated with people attempting to reach Australia by boat. And then Kevin Rudd came in 2007, and in 2008 reintroduced onshore processing with the support of the Greens. So if people came to Australia by boat, they were brought to Australia. The Greens' main problem with the Labor's policy at that time was that the Greens didn't support mandatory detention. It's an important point here because mandatory detention would have provided a disincentive against people attempting that boat journey. But so Labor's policy so the Greens' policy provided an even greater incentive for people to risk that boat journey. So there's some key questions we're going to ask here today. And the answer is seemingly obvious, and this goes to the hypocrisy in the Greens' position here. So in 2008, onshore processing was reintroduced. Subsequently, in the next 5 years, to 2013, around 55,000 asylum seekers attempted a boat journey to Australia, and more than 1 in 50 of them died at sea. So we got, I think, 1157 from memory here, but it's generally widely accepted that around 1,200 people died during that time. And coalition government were telling us for a long time that this was a concern. I think they've mentioned deaths at sea every time I've seen them talk about refugees for a very long time. But anyway, I supported the reintroduction of onshore processing as a member of the Greens at this time. And then we started watching boatload after boatload of asylum seekers drowning. It was a terrible period. And so around the same time as Julia Gillard, the Labor Party, I changed my policy and started trying to lobby my former colleagues in the Greens to change their policy and mourn and remember those people that we had helped kill, and to change their policy to regional outreach, to improving the offshore processing regime, rather than to provide an incentive to risk those very dangerous boat journeys where 1 in 50 people who attempt them dies. So anyway, after 2013, 2012, offshore processing was reintroduced by Labor, and then the deaths started dropping off, and then boat turnbacks commenced, and then we've had 0 recorded drownings in that subsequently for the last 12 years, approximately 12 years. And this data is from something's run out of Monash Uni called the Australian Border Deaths Database. So here we're targeting Larissa Waters and the Greens for their silence around these deaths at sea, and we're asking refugee advocates such as yourself, I hope, people who care about outcomes for refugees, a once proud political lobby in this country, now unfortunately nobbled and deeply compromised by the continuing advocacy for the tragically and utterly failed policy of onshore processing. Okay, so with this, the nature of this, the nobbled advocates and the where it's gone wrong, we find some very sad commentary. So, for example, I was speaking to a vocal and heavily involved member of the Refugee Action Coalition, the RAC, a few years ago now, and I was running through these figures with him, and he didn't dispute any of the figures about the number of asylum seekers that had attempted to reach or the number of deaths. But what he said was that 1 in 50 people dying represented a pretty good success rate for people attempting to reach Australia. That person does not deserve the term of a refugee advocate. He is rather an imbecile. There's a simple concept called duty of care. We have a duty of care to prevent those deaths. We know that we can prevent those deaths. And the beauty of that approach is, part of the beauty is, one, we can prevent these deaths, but it also means it doesn't prevent us from working to prevent deaths elsewhere. We can continue doing our best with outreach programs, improving the institutional capacity regionally and globally, with Australia playing a responsible role, without and at the same time, we can prevent those deaths. So the ASRC, the Asylum Seeker Research Centre, they also need to stand up in relation to this. They've been silent and continued to fail to credit the relevance of these deaths, to remember and mourn these people, and to acknowledge that we got this policy so wrong. Refugee advocates have got this policy so wrong. And there's a way that we can make better outcomes for refugees and other vulnerable people, and once again become a proud lobby group in Australian politics. And so there's a specific question we want to ask here, and I've been asking various Greens this same question for a long time. What happened to me was, when I started raising these issues back in 2012, watching these boatload after boatload of asylum seekers drowning week after week in the news, I began raising these issues with my Greens comrades, my former colleagues in the Greens, and what I got for my trouble, a decade of abuse. So this is a significant part of Greens' defence of their policy, is not so much to defend their policy, but just to say that people who support offshore processing are necessarily torture supporters. That was one classic from, I can't think of his name right now, former senator for the Greens. Racist, heartless, this dialogue of shaming outsiders. So this is part of what you need to reject, as in rejecting the Greens and not voting Green and speaking to your Greens representatives, asking them this question. That question is, does onshore processing kill? Because what we have here is a thing that looks a lot like, statistically speaking, we can say it is effectively certain that onshore processing during this time has provided a pull factor or incentive. It's provided an incentive that has encouraged people to risk a boat journey to Australia, wherein so many deaths have ensued. So the question is, do these pull factors provide an incentive that put people onto boats wherein they have subsequently died? It seems a simple question because the stats are so clear, it's so obvious that onshore processing is the causative factor in those deaths. But if you are a green hobnob, this is not a question that you can easily answer, because the answer to this question, the only reasonable answer to this question, has the capacity to tear your party in half. So systematically, we've found this question not being answered. Adam Bant, Larissa Waters, spookily silent. Senator Orman Payne, directly refusing to answer the question. Nick McKim, I wrote to him a number of times, absolutely refuses to engage in dialogue around this issue. Chandler Mather, another one, reasonable chat with him, refused to answer the question. Because the stats are so clear, the Greens will sound ridiculous if they say, no, onshore processing did not provide that incentive or that pull factor. But then they also can't say that it did provide that full pull factor, because if it provided that pull factor, as it seemingly so obviously has, then onshore processing is a tragically failed policy. What we find is that the Greens have been conveniently unremembering 1,200 deaths. 1,200 deaths that are so obviously associated with their own failed policy. And we've got this word here, hypocrisy. Greens' hypocrisy. In it, claiming to be advocates for refugees and then deliberately and conveniently unremembering all those people that have died associated with that policy. So there's a way forward. And that way forward is through increased regional and global capacity to support the welfare and security of vulnerable people, with Australia playing a responsible role in that. In terms of offshore policies, we can provide disincentives against people attempting a boat journey to Australia, while at the same time working to support the welfare of those people. So what we can say is, if a person gets on a boat and they're in a desperate, dire situation, then we can take them to a regional facility, a refugee facility, such as in Cox's Bazar at the moment. And then we can work to improve those facilities, especially across the Asia Pacific, obviously, in the Australian context. And then if someone who's not in such desperate circumstances, they're getting on a boat, if they're, say, trying to gain some advantage, gaining access to Australia, they put their kids on a boat, 1 in 50 chance of death, then those people lock them up. So you provide that punitive approach if the people are not in desperate circumstances, and you provide the welfare support for the people who are vulnerable. So there's a clear program for refugee advocates, but unfortunately people who claim to be refugee advocates, like that, did I call that other fellow an imbecile? Senator Hanson-Young. She told us there are no pull factors, while failing to account for these 1,200 dead people that have seemingly very clearly died as a result of those pull factors. She is an imbecile. the Greens are deeply compromised, and they are holding us back from building better refugee policy with outreach programs through the Asia Pacific, improved standards of how we deal with the offshore processing regime, providing disincentives against people attempting those ungoverned, very dangerous journeys with people smuggling. We can maintain these disincentives and this proud record here where nobody has died. We've got a duty of care to maintain that record. At the same time, we as advocates can build better refugee policies in support of vulnerable people, helping support their welfare and security, and providing channels for them to return home as soon as possible, or otherwise have them well supported through time. So that's the whole of my talk here. This is an important part of my campaign. I'm asking people who are refugee advocates, who care about outcomes for refugees, to don't vote Greens. Don't vote for Chandler Mather. Don't vote for Senator Waters. Don't vote for Adam Bandt if you're happening to be watching this from Melbourne. That guy is a fool. What did I call them? Imbeciles? Fools? That's literally nothing compared to the abuse I got from those dodgy fools. So you can see I get a bit disturbed by this issue, but what I'm asking you, if you are someone who cares about outcomes for refugees, it is time to reclaim a grand political tradition of advocating for good outcomes for refugees that does not involve deeply compromising your own credibility by conveniently unremembering all those people that I, for one, have helped to kill. So I'm going to give you a couple of chances here to maybe take a screenshot or have a pause. That's the little flyer that I made. It looks at the Greens' reasoning in defence of their policy. Here we have glib mistruths, such as there are no pull factors, enabling conspiracy theories, where they suggested that the people are still dying but we're not being told. There's tragically flawed ethical argument, whereby the Greens have suggested that those people would probably die anyway. But yeah, we dealt with that. We have a duty of care to prevent those particular deaths, and we can also work to prevent deaths elsewhere. And this fourth one here, the classic, the shaming of others. They've engaged, literally the Greens don't even attempt to support their own policy, they just criticise other people. So I'm asking you, if you were thinking of voting Green, please don't. And if you were associated with, if you are associated with some Greens, please ask them, does onshore processing kill? Did onshore processing provide a pull factor that provided an incentive for those 55,000 people to get on boats, with more than 1 in 50 of them now dead? Here's the other little picture that you get to see. Okay, so have a good day.